Okay, so Darcy is a graduate student in the social psychology area, and she is in the attitudes and persuasion lab. And so she is interested in how different factors influence the way that different protest actions, and by extension, social movements are perceived, as well as how these factors, such as the perception of violence at these events and the groups that protesters belong to, are directly affect disenfranchised peoples who are more likely to participate in these types of protests. All right, thanks, Darcy.
Thank you for that introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, cool. So as I said, I am a member of the Attitudes and Persuasion Lab and in social psych, and my presentation today will be on the role of violence and group status in support for specific protest actions. So why do people protest, right? Why leave your house to go out in the street and wave some signs and yell? So the main goal for protesters is to have their movement viewed favorably, and then by extension, affect social change. However, past research has shown that nonviolent campaigns tend to be much more successful than violent campaigns when it comes to creating the change that people want to see, that the protesters want to see. So that is to say that the mere perception, however, of violence can cause people to view movements less favorably than if they were less favorably and support law and order policies more. Law and order policies being more support for police and essentially for those protesters to be shut down. And that in turn decreases their support for those protesters. So to illustrate the effect, we have a review from the ACLED, which is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, which is a nonprofit, reviewed over 10,000 different Black Lives Matter protests and found that over 95% of them were peaceful. However, in a poll conducted by 538, which is a political think tank, they found that 42% of Americans believe that most Black Lives Matter protesters are trying to incite violence and destroy property. So right there, we can see a discrepancy between the actual amount of violence and the perceived violence that these protesters are doing. And this is, of course, important because then that can affect people's support for the protest at large. So moving on to groups, which is the other side of the coin that we're looking at today. Group identification, so how much you identify with a certain group, affects how likely you are to participate in a protest action. And by extension, it affects your support of people who are protesting for that action. So if you are pro-choice, you're much more likely to support pro-choice protesters than you are pro-life protesters, and vice versa. So moving on to our study, we have a proof of concept that looks at, namely, the abortion question. Not the abortion question, the abortion protest question. So we collected this data at the beginning of last semester when I'm sure most of you know that the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision was very salient in everyone's mind. So starting off, we asked participants their position on abortion, whether or not they were pro-choice or pro-life, how strongly they held that position, and their attitudinal ambivalence and attitudinal certainty for that position. They were then shown one of 6 prompts. Now, these prompts could show either a pro-life or pro-choice protest or here we have both examples, a violent protest. So these were all stylized to be sort of a mock-up of a summary of a news article that you would see on Facebook. These are, of course, fake protest events and fake articles from Con News. So we have conditions here for a violent protest, a non-violent protest that is both pro-life or pro-choice, and a non-violent gathering. So with a gathering specifically, that's just people who are pro-life or pro-choice getting together to discuss the benefits of their position. So participants were shown one of those 6 prompts. And then after showing them one of those 6 prompts, they were asked how much they supported those specific protesters. So how legitimate is this protest? Would you have wanted to join the protesters? Do you support the protesters? Their attitude towards abortion as a whole. And once again, their attitudinal ambivalence and attitudinal certainty towards abortion as a whole. So moving on to results. We had 408 REP participants. They kept giving me REP hours and I kept using them. Thank you so much to the REP office. We found that just some interesting descriptive statistics, 18% of our participants were pro-life, while 82 approximately % of them were pro-choice. we had a lovely 50-50 in-group out-group split. So people who are pro-life being shown a pro-life protest in the in-group condition, and people who are pro-life being shown a pro-choice protest in the out-group condition, and a lovely sort of 1/3 split with the violent protest, nonviolent protest, and nonviolent gatherings. So moving on to people's support for the protests, we have here a set of, do we have a laser? Yes, we have here some group means by support group means by group and type. So group being whether or not the protesters belonged to their group, in group, out group, and type being the type of protest. So whether or not it was a violent protest, nonviolent protest, or nonviolent gathering. So we can see here that, and I also have some ANOVAs down here for how significant they are. So we can see that the type of protest and whether or not there was violence did have a very significant effect on people's support for the protest actions. However, the group that they belonged to didn't seem to have as much of an effect, which is interesting and goes a little bit against what we were expecting. Another interesting thing here is that we can see that particularly in the in-group condition, people support nonviolent protests more than nonviolent gatherings. And we assume that this is because those nonviolent protests are seen as more of an actionable event than just a gathering where people are getting together to talk about something. So moving on then to abortion attitude as a whole, we also wanted to see not just how these factors affected people's support for the specific protest action, but also the movement as a whole that they were representing. And here, once again, well, not once again, well, here we can see that obviously their position, the question that we asked them at the beginning is whether or not they were more pro-choice or pro-life, greatly affected their support for abortion as a whole, but also type here is approaching significance at a 0.06, right on the edge. So it does seem that there might be an effect of violence might have an effect on people's view for the movement as a whole. So we're going to continue to look into that. And both of these don't have any interaction effects. I didn't point that out. So in conclusion, yes, the way that different factors, including violence, specifically including violence, can have an effect on people's perception of different protest actions. And these factors, such as perceiving, which can extend to perceiving different groups as more violent, can indeed affect disenfranchised people and their ability to create change. Thank you. I will now be taking questions.
Do you see any effects in terms of gender and in terms of the participants?
So we did see some interesting gender effects when it came to their abortion attitude as a whole. I couldn't include them due to time constraints. I think one of the most interesting things that we saw for gender, so we wanted to be inclusive and also included transgender individuals in our study, was that we found a surprising amount of them had a pro-life position that was very secure.
Do you have any plans in the future to go beyond an REP sample, which is these really awkward distribution splits to try to collect data?
Yes, we're already running another study on prolific, which allows us to have a 50-50 pro-choice, pro-life split. And that will also be looking at different individual differences, such as people's social dominance, orientation, and need for cognition.
All right, thank you.